47 boots hit the ground at the same time because Sergeant Hollister always insisted we march in proper formation even through no man's land, and I know the exact count because I was 3 meters behind the line tying my bootlace when the world turned white and went sideways, and I heard what I can only describe as a single sound made of 47 smaller sounds, happening so close together they became one thunderclap of dirt and metal and meat. My name is Private First Class Donovan Marsh. I was assigned to 2nd Platoon, 7th Company, 445th Combined Infantry Regiment, and I am writing this because someone has to understand what happened on the Crassian Flats and why, and because the Medicae officer says putting words down helps with the episodes. She is wrong about that. Nothing helps with the episodes. But I write anyway because the dead deserve a witness, and because I saw something in those final moments before they loaded me onto the Medicae transport that changed everything I thought I knew about this war and about the men who send us to fight it. The ground was grey that morning, not brown, not tan, not the red clay we had been slogging through for the previous 6 weeks. Grey like old metal, like the ration tins we threw into the waste pits, like ash from the cremation fires that burned constantly behind our forward operating base. Someone in logistics had told us the Crassian Flats used to be farmland before the war, grain fields stretching to the horizon, feeding 3 subsectors. Now it was grey and dead and flat as a parade ground, and command said we needed to cross it to reach Objective Tertius, a ridgeline that our artillery spotters needed for the push into the enemy fortifications beyond. I remember thinking the flatness was wrong. We had been fighting through ruins and rubble for so long that open ground felt obscene, felt exposed, felt like walking naked through a cathedral where everyone was watching. But Sergeant Hollister said the Auspex sweeps showed no enemy presence, and the counter-battery stations had been silent for 36 hours, and the ground looked solid enough to hold tanks, so it would certainly hold infantry, and besides we had our orders. I had been having trouble with my left boot for 3 days. The sole was separating from the upper, and mud kept working its way in, no matter how many times I tried to seal it with promethium adhesive or binding cord, or pure desperation. That morning I had wrapped the whole mess in a strip of tent canvas and tied it so tight my circulation was compromised, and when the binding started to slip I should have kept walking, should have stayed in formation, should have trusted that the boot would hold until we reached the objective. Instead, I dropped to one knee and told Corporal Hastings to tell the sergeant I would catch up in 30 seconds. Hastings nodded. He had a face like crumpled paper, all lines and angles from too many years under foreign suns, and his eyes were the color of spent brass casings. He said something I did not hear properly because the wind was picking up and carrying sound away, something that might have been a joke about my feet, or a complaint about the food, or a comment on the weather. I was focused on my boot. I did not look up. I heard his footsteps crunch away, and I pulled the knot tight, and I looked up just in time to see them die. The mines were not visible. They had been buried beneath the grey soil at a depth of approximately 15 centimeters, according to the post-action report I was not supposed to see, but which I saw anyway, because the clerk in the records office owed me for covering his watch shifts when his hands shook too badly to hold a stylus. 15 centimeters of grey ash and grey soil and grey silence hiding enough explosive material to erase 47 human beings from the galaxy in less time than it takes to blink. I did not blink. That is the strange thing. Some survival reflex kept my eyes open and fixed on the point where my platoon had been. So I saw everything in perfect terrible clarity. I saw Hastings rise into the air with his arms spread like he was trying to fly. I saw Sergeant Hollister come apart at the waist, his upper body spinning one direction and his legs collapsing in another. I saw Private Kimura become a red mist that drifted briefly in the wind before settling back to earth. I saw faces I had eaten with and slept beside and complained about and relied upon for months turn into fragments that rained down across a blast radius of approximately 50 meters in every direction except mine. The sound came after the sight, which should not be possible but was. A wall of pressure hit my chest and threw me backward, and I landed on my back staring at the sky, which was still grey, still empty, still indifferent to everything that had just happened. Then the sound caught up. Not an explosion exactly, more like a vast inhalation, like the world itself had gasped, followed by a rolling thunder crack that went on for much longer than any natural sound should go on. I felt it in my teeth, in my bones, in the spaces behind my eyes where nightmares live. Then came the silence. I have experienced silences before. The hush after a bombardment ends, the quiet of a bunker at night when everyone is too exhausted to speak, the emptiness of a barracks room after casualties have been taken. None of those silences was like this one. This silence had weight, had texture, had a physical presence that pressed against my eardrums from both sides at once. I lay on my back with my hands pressed over my ears and I could hear nothing at all. Not my own breathing, not my heartbeat, not the wind, just pure, perfect, absolute nothing. The silence lasted for 11 seconds. I counted them afterward by replaying the memory in my head over and over again, which is something I do now whether I want to or not, and I am certain of the count. 11 seconds of total sensory deprivation, while the dust settled and the smoke cleared and the scattered debris finished falling back to earth. Then the sounds started. They came in layers. First the ringing, high and persistent, and centered somewhere behind my left eye. Then the crackle of small fires burning in pockets of spilled promethium and shattered equipment. Then the patter of soil and gravel still falling from the sky like black rain. Then the wind returning slowly, carrying the smell of scorched meat and copper and something chemical I could not identify, but which made my throat close up. Then the voices. I pushed myself to my hands and knees and vomited into the grey dirt, and I could hear them now, the ones who had not died instantly. The ones who had been at the edges of the formation or who had been shielded by the bodies of their comrades, or who had simply been unlucky enough to survive the initial blasts in a condition that made survival seem like a punishment rather than a gift. They were screaming and whimpering and calling out names and asking questions that had no answers and making sounds that were not quite language anymore, just raw vocalization, just pain trying to escape through whatever opening it could find. I crawled forward. The ground was hot in places and cold in others, and something was wrong with my depth perception, so I could not tell how far I was traveling. 10 meters, 20, 50. I found a crater and looked down into it and saw what remained of Corporal Hastings looking back up at me. He was still alive. That should not have been possible. He was missing everything below the rib cage and his left arm was gone, and there was a piece of metal the size of my palm embedded in his forehead, but his eyes were open and tracking and his mouth was moving, and I crawled down into the crater with him because I could not think of anything else to do. His lips shaped words I could not hear over the ringing. I pressed my ear close to his mouth and I heard him say, very clearly, very calmly, they knew. The bastards knew. Then his eyes stopped moving and the shape of his mouth went slack, and I was alone in a hole with a corpse that had been my friend, and around me 45 other people were either dead or dying, and I did not understand what he meant, but I knew in some deep and terrible way that I needed to find out. I climbed out of the crater. The landscape had transformed. What had been flat and grey and featureless was now a pock-marked hellscape of overlapping blast zones, some of them still smoking, all of them containing fragments of what had been human beings. I saw a hand still gripping a lasgun, the fingers locked in permanent tension. I saw a leg, still booted, standing upright as if waiting for the rest of its body to return. I saw a helmet rolling slowly across the uneven ground, propelled by the wind, and when it turned, I saw the face still inside it, frozen in an expression of mild surprise. The dying took time. That was the worst part. Mines are designed to incapacitate, not to kill cleanly, and even mass detonations leave survivors who require hours or days to finish dying. I moved from crater to crater and found 7 of my platoon members still conscious, still aware, still capable of recognizing me and asking for things I could not provide. Water, medication, an end. Private First Class Marcus Webb was missing his legs and most of his face, but his hands still worked, and he grabbed my sleeve and would not let go. He kept saying he could not feel his feet and asking me to check on them. I did not tell him the truth. I held his hand and I told him his feet were fine, and I stayed with him until the shaking stopped, which took about 40 minutes. Corporal Teresa Vance had been thrown clear of the blast zone by some freak of physics and had only minor injuries to her extremities, but a piece of shrapnel had opened her abdomen, and she was holding her own intestines in her hands and looking at them with an expression of profound confusion. She asked me to help her put them back. I tried. They would not stay. She died while I was still trying. Sergeant Hollister's upper body had landed approximately 30 meters from where I last saw his lower body. His eyes were still blinking when I found him. His mouth was still giving orders. "Reform on the ridge line," he said. "Stay in formation, watch your spacing." Then his eyes focused on me, really saw me, and he said, "Marsh, good. You'll need to report this. Tell them we maintained discipline. Tell them we followed procedure." I wanted to ask him what had gone wrong. I wanted to ask him if he had known about the mines. I wanted to ask him why we had been sent across a flat grey field that anyone with basic tactical training could see was a perfect kill zone. But his eyes unfocused and his mouth stopped moving, and I was alone again with nothing but questions and the stink of burning bodies. I spent the next 3 hours moving through the debris. I found no other survivors. I found 22 intact dog tags, which I collected and put in my pocket. I found pieces of equipment, most of it destroyed, some of it salvageable. I found Sergeant Hollister's field journal, still attached to his webbing, still readable despite the blood and the dirt. I put it in my other pocket. I did not read it then. I was not ready. The extraction team arrived at dusk. They were from a different company, strangers with clean uniforms and expressions of practiced sympathy that did not touch their eyes. They asked me what had happened, and I told them. They asked me if there had been other survivors, and I told them no. They asked me if I had seen anything unusual before the detonation, and I said no, which was a lie, because I had seen something unusual, but I did not yet understand what it meant, and I did not want to share my confusion with strangers. They loaded me onto a transport and gave me a sedative and told me I would be debriefed in the morning and I should try to rest. The sedative did not work. I lay on the stretcher and stared at the ceiling of the transport bay and felt the vibration of the engines through the thin mattress, and I thought about what Hastings had said in the crater. They knew. The bastards knew. I did not sleep that night or the night after or the night after that. I lay in the Medicae bay with my untreated injuries slowly becoming infected, and my untreated mind slowly becoming something else, something focused and sharp and angry in ways I had not been angry before. On the 4th day, when my fever finally broke and the Medicae officers stopped looking at me like I was going to die, I asked for permission to access the regimental archives. I was told no. I asked again. I was told no. I asked a 3rd time and was informed that continued requests would be noted in my disciplinary file, so I stopped asking and started looking on my own. The clerk in the records office was named Patterson. We had become friends during basic training when we discovered we were both from agricultural worlds, and both had fathers who had died in the same tithe uprising, and both had a taste for the illicit spirits that flowed through the lower decks of every transport ship. Patterson's hands shook now, because he had been exposed to a nerve agent during the fighting at Valcross Ridge, and the antidote had side effects that the Medicaid officers said would fade in time, but which seemed to be getting worse rather than better. He could not write, he could barely hold a cup, but he could still read, and he could still tell me where to find things, and when I explained what I was looking for, he went very quiet and very still, and then he said, "You do not want to find that." I said I did. He said, "No, you really do not. Some things, Marsh, some things are designed to stay buried, like mines." The comparison was not subtle. I did not care. I told him about Hastings and what he had said, and I told him about the field that was too flat and too grey and too empty. And I told him about the way the formation had been arranged and the way I had been 3 meters behind the line when the world ended. Patterson listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him, and when I finished he closed his eyes and took a deep breath and said, "The mapping surveys are in the 3rd cabinet on the left, 2nd drawer from the bottom. The deployment orders are in the locked case by the window. I will forget to secure it tonight after my shift ends. You have until morning prayers. I found the surveys at 0200 hours. They were standard Imperial geological assessments, the kind that precede any major military operation, the kind that identify terrain features and soil composition and potential hazards. I found the section covering the Crassian Flats, and I saw the notation that made my hands start shaking almost as badly as Patterson's. Subsurface anomalies detected. Recommend engineering sweep prior to infantry transit. The recommendation was dated 6 days before our platoon received orders to cross. I found the deployment orders at 0315 hours. They were routine, standard, unremarkable in every way except one. At the bottom of the final page, handwritten in a script I recognized immediately, were 5 words, "Ensure 2nd platoon takes point." The handwriting belonged to Captain Gerald Morse, our company commander, a man I had served under for 3 years, a man I had trusted with my life on multiple occasions, a man who had sat with me the night my brother died, and told me that loss was the price of service, but that service gave loss meaning. Captain Gerald Morse, who had chosen my platoon to lead the crossing. Captain Gerald Morse, who had received the survey results 6 days before the order was signed. Captain Gerald Morse, who had known. I put the documents back where I found them. I returned to the Medicaid bay. I lay on my cot and stared at the ceiling, and I did not feel the anger I expected to feel. What I felt instead was cold. A deep, bone-aching cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the realization that I had spent 3 years trusting a man who had sent 47 people to die because of a notation in a report and a decision that was made for reasons I did not yet understand. The next morning I asked to see Captain Morse. I was told he was unavailable. I asked again in the afternoon. I was told he was in meetings. I asked a 3rd time and was informed that my continued requests were causing concern among the staff officers, and perhaps I should speak with the regiment's spiritual advisor about processing my grief in more appropriate ways. I did not want to process my grief in appropriate ways. I wanted answers. But direct approaches were clearly not going to work, so I started listening instead of asking. I lingered near the command tents. I found reasons to pass through the officers' mess during mealtimes. I volunteered for extra duties that put me near the communications hub, where reports and orders passed through on their way to somewhere else. And slowly, piece by piece, I assembled a picture of what had happened and why. Captain Morse was in debt, Not gambling debts or personal loans, but something more complicated, something political. His family held land rights on a world called Terrace Prime, a minor agrarian colony that had recently been selected for absorption into a larger administrative unit controlled by a rival noble house. The absorption would strip the Morse family of their holdings, their titles, their social standing, their everything. Unless Captain Morse could demonstrate sufficient value to the governor's office that an exception might be made. Sufficient value. The phrase appeared in several intercepted communications. What constituted sufficient value remained unclear until I found the final piece of the puzzle. There was a war hero shortage. The campaign on Crassus VII had been going poorly for months, with insufficient victories and insufficient casualties, and insufficient everything to justify the resources being poured into the operation. The governor needed results. The general staff needed results, and results, in the calculus of imperial warfare, meant stories. Stories of sacrifice and heroism and devotion unto death. Stories that could be printed in the regimental newsletters and broadcast on the Vox networks, and used to justify continued funding and continued support and continued faith in the leadership that was directing the war effort. 2nd Platoon had been selected to provide one of those stories. We were going to die on the Crassian flats. We were always going to die. The mines were not a surprise to anyone except us. They had been mapped, analyzed, and incorporated into a plan that required a mass casualty event to generate the propaganda material that the governor's office needed to maintain political support for the war. Captain Morse knew. The general staff knew. The only people who did not know were the 47 men and women who walked into the kill zone in perfect formation because their sergeant insisted on maintaining discipline even in no man's land. I should have reported this through proper channels. I should have filed a formal complaint with the regimental commissar. I should have trusted the system to correct itself, to punish the guilty, to ensure that such a thing could never happen again. But I had watched the system digest 47 bodies and spit out a commendation for Captain Morse, who was praised in the official after-action report for the heroic sacrifice of his troops, and who was being considered for promotion to the command staff as a result, so I stopped trusting the system. And I started planning something else. I found Captain Morse on the 7th night after the crossing. He was alone in his quarters, working late on reports, the kind of paperwork that captains always complained about, but secretly enjoyed because it kept them away from the front lines and the dying and the consequences of their decisions. His tent was well appointed by field standards, with an actual cot and an actual desk and an actual lamp that burned actual promethium rather than the chemical glow strips the rest of us used. He looked up when I entered, and his face went through several expressions very quickly, settling finally on something like resigned expectation. "Private Marsh," he said, "I wondered when you would come. I had not expected that. I had expected denial or confusion or perhaps an attempt to summon the guards. What I had not expected was for him to look at me with something almost like relief, like he had been waiting for this conversation, like he wanted to explain. 'You knew,' I said. 'Yes.' 'You knew, and you sent us anyway.' 'Yes.' I waited for the justification, for the greater good argument, for the necessary sacrifice excuse, for some elaborate rationalization that would make his actions seem almost reasonable if you looked at them from the right angle. But he did not offer any of that. He just sat at his desk with his hands folded and his eyes steady and looked at me like I was a problem he had been trying to solve for a very long time. "Do you know how many soldiers die in this regiment every year?" he asked. I did not answer. The question felt rhetorical. 4,312, he said, on average. Some years more, some years less, but the average holds. 4,312 dead, gone, erased from the rolls, replaced by fresh bodies from the tithe worlds, forgotten within a month except by the people who loved them, who also die eventually, taking the last memories with them. He paused. 47 is not even a rounding error. 47 is statistical noise. They were my friends. I know. I am sorry for that. Truly. He sounded like he meant it, which made everything worse. But the alternative was worse. The campaign was failing. Resources were being diverted. The governor was losing patience. If something did not change, if something did not generate the momentum needed to continue the operation, the entire sector was going to be abandoned. Hundreds of millions of people left to the enemy. Entire worlds burned. The 47 deaths of 2nd Platoon prevented that outcome. You do not know that. No, he admitted. I do not know it. But the General Staff believed it. The Governor believed it. And when men of that rank believe something, they make it true, whether it started true or not. The story of 2nd Platoon's heroic sacrifice has already been transmitted to 17 subsectors. Recruitment is up. Morale is stabilizing. The supply lines are being reinforced because 47 people died in a way that could be turned into propaganda. I stared at him. I tried to find the hatred I had been cultivating for days, the cold anger that had driven me to investigate and plan and come to his tent in the middle of the night with half-formed intentions of violence. But what I found instead was something closer to despair, because I understood him. I did not agree with him, I did not forgive him, but I understood the mathematics he was describing. In a war this vast, with stakes this high, 47 deaths were indeed statistical noise. My friends were indeed rounding errors, and the only thing that gave their deaths any meaning at all was the story being told about them, a story built on lies, a story that Captain Morse had crafted to serve purposes they would have despised. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you figured it out, because you were going to confront me anyway, and because... He hesitated, and for the first time I saw something like uncertainty in his expression. Because I need you to understand that what happens next is not personal. I heard the footsteps behind me a moment too late. Hands grabbed my arms and pulled them behind my back, and I was forced to my knees, and I saw Captain Morse stand and walk around his desk and stop in front of me with an expression of what looked almost like regret. The problem with survivors, he said, is that they remember. They ask questions, they find documents that should have been destroyed, they become complications. He knelt so we were at eye level. I did not want this, Marsh. I wanted the mines to finish their work. But you survived, which means there is a story about your survival that needs to be incorporated into the larger narrative. The sole survivor of 2nd Platoon, driven mad by grief, attacking his commanding officer in a delusional rage. He stood again. It is not as elegant as I would prefer, but it will serve. The guards behind me tightened their grip. I felt something cold press against the back of my skull, the unmistakable shape of a las pistol barrel, and I understood that I was about to die for surviving, that my story was about to be rewritten by the same hands that had written my platoon's death, that there would be no justice and no accountability and no truth, just another layer of lies burying another collection of corpses. I thought about Hastings in the crater, telling me they knew. I thought about Sergeant Hollister's upper body giving orders to soldiers who were already dead. I thought about Private Webb asking me to check on feet that no longer existed, and Corporal Vance trying to hold her own organs in her hands, and all the other moments of terrible intimate suffering that had filled those hours on the Crassian Flats. I thought about Patterson and his shaking hands, and the way he had known somehow that the truth I was seeking would destroy me. And I thought about the field journal in my pocket, Sergeant Hollister's field journal, which I had never read, which I had forgotten about in the chaos of investigation and anger and despair. The journal that contained the sergeant's own observations about the mission, the journal that might contain information about the mines, the journal that I had been carrying for 7 days without remembering it was there. "Captain," I said, "there is something you should know. It will not matter." Sergeant Hollister kept a journal, a field journal, standard issue, the kind every NCO maintains. He was carrying it when he died. I recovered it from his remains. The captain's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a new tension that had not been there before. "It contains his observations about the mission," I continued, "including his concerns about the terrain, including his note that he had questioned the route and been overruled by someone at command level, including, I suspect, other observations that might prove inconvenient." "Where is it?" "I sent it to a friend before I came here, with instructions to deliver it to the commissariat if I did not return by morning. This was a lie. The journal was in my pocket. I had not read it. I had not sent it anywhere. But Captain Morse did not know that, and the uncertainty in his eyes told me I had found something he was afraid of, something that his careful calculations had not accounted for. He stared at me for a long moment. The pressure of the las pistol against my skull did not change, but no one pulled the trigger. Finally, the captain made a small gesture, and the hands released my arms, and I stumbled forward and caught myself on the edge of his desk. "You are smarter than your file suggests," he said, "or more desperate. Either way, we seem to have reached an impasse. Let me go. Let me transfer to another unit. Let me disappear into the ranks like I should have done in the first place. The journal stays where it is as long as I stay alive. You get your promotion, your family keeps their lands, your story survives. Everyone wins, except the 47. They lost the moment you signed that order. Nothing changes that now." He considered. I could see him, running calculations, weighing risks, trying to determine if I was telling the truth about the journal or bluffing, and whether the potential cost of being wrong outweighed the certain benefit of eliminating me now. It was the same cold mathematics he had used to send my platoon to their deaths, the same equation that reduced human beings to variables in someone else's algorithm. "There is a transport leaving for the Calix front tomorrow," he said finally. "Penal battalion reinforcements. The survival rate is approximately 7%. You could be on that transport. Done. No journal, no testimony, no sudden attacks of conscience years from now when you think the danger has passed. You disappear, Marsh, completely and permanently." I did not hesitate. The penal battalions were death sentences, everyone knew that, but they were death sentences that at least allowed for the possibility of fighting back, of dying on your own terms rather than someone else's, of maybe, possibly, impossibly surviving through pure stubbornness and refusing to stay dead the way you were supposed to. I had survived the Crassian Flats when 47 others had not. Maybe I could survive this too. "Done," I said again. Captain Morse nodded. The guards escorted me out. I spent the night in a holding cell, and the next morning I was processed onto the transport along with 300 other soldiers who had been convicted of various infractions or selected for various reasons, or simply been too inconvenient to keep in their original units. None of them asked why I was there. Penal battalions did not ask questions. They just died over and over again until there was no one left to die. But I did not die. Not in the first engagement or the second or the third. Not in the trench collapse or the artillery barrage or the desperate last stand that killed 2/3 of my new unit. I kept moving, kept fighting, kept surviving when everyone around me fell, because that was what I did now. That was what I had become. The one who does not die. The one who walks away from kill zones. The one who carries the weight of the dead like a physical burden that he cannot put down, because putting it down would mean admitting that their deaths meant nothing. 6 months into my penal service, I received word that Captain Morse had been promoted. A year after that, I heard he had been assigned to the governor's personal staff. The campaign on Crassus VII was declared a success, the enemy forces pushed back, the sector secured for the Imperium of Man. 2nd Platoon's sacrifice was mentioned in the official histories, their names inscribed on a memorial somewhere, their deaths transmuted into inspiration for future generations of soldiers. I still have Sergeant Hollister's journal. I have never read it. I do not know if it contains what I claimed it did, or if I was bluffing with nothing but desperation and luck. Some nights I think about opening it, about finding out what the sergeant really thought about the mission and the route, and the flat grey field that was always going to be a grave. But then I remember the way his upper body kept giving orders after his lower body was gone, the way his mouth formed words even after his eyes stopped seeing, and I put the journal back in my pocket and I go out to fight again. Maybe someday I will read it. Maybe someday I will find out whether the truth I claimed to possess actually exists. But for now, the not knowing is what keeps me alive. The possibility that there is evidence somewhere that proves what was done, the threat that lingers over Captain Morse's career like an unexploded mine, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the right pressure to set it off. They say there are no survivors of 2nd Platoon. The official record lists me as killed in action, one of the 47, my name inscribed on the memorial alongside Hastings and Webb and Vance and all the others. As far as the Imperium knows, I died on the Crassian Flats with my bootlace finally tied and my place in formation finally taken. But I did not die. I am still here, still walking, still counting the steps between one explosion and the next. And somewhere, in a drawer or a pocket or buried beneath 15 centimeters of grey soil, the truth is waiting to be found by whoever comes after me. The mines are still there. The mines are always there. The only question is who will step on them next.